Fáilte. Welcome to this episode of The Language Question, Ceis na Tongan, a conversation about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about their relationship with it and its role in our identity. Our guest in this episode is Patricia Mac Eoin. Patricia is a qualified solicitor and accredited translator. She has worked in TG Ceathair, the Irish language TV station, and at the European Commission translating official documentation into Irish. She has translated many children's books from both French and English into Irish, and has also written her own series of books for children in Irish based on the misadventures of Tony the vet and his dog Trixie. Along with Dr. Eilish Ní Gúil, she is the co-editor of the book Short Stories in Irish for Beginners. They also created the Foundation Irish audio course using the Michelle Thomas method. She is now the owner of her own online Irish language school for adults called All About Irish, through which she offers Irish language courses to adults from beginner to advanced level, and also a learning through Irish literature course. Her courses allow people to engage with the language in a different and more enjoyable way. I found Patricia's enthusiasm for the language and her innovative ways in which she helps learners all across the globe to engage with the language inspiring. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. As always, I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate, and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to ensure that you stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Anyhow, here goes with this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Gumwina tú soltas. A Patricia a cara tá fáilte is fisarót agus tám Harbh weach díad as ucht a bheling an show.
Gur míle maigad flir tá an sásta fad bheit an seo leat. Gur míle maigad.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here, my wonderful friend, and somebody who, in fact, I'm a former student of Patricia's. I have to confess, I've taken many of the All About Irish courses, and will testify to the expertise of this wonderful guest here today in helping out learners. But before we get into the detail of that, Patricia, I'd love just to learn more about your background in the language. How did it feature in your life growing up, for instance, and how did you come to the language?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Kinvara, Fleur, in South County Galway, North Clare there. That's where I grew up. It's not a Gaeltacht area, but I would have had a lot of Irish in my home because my parents, when they first married, my father was teaching. He's from Dublin, actually, but he was teaching out on Inishmore. And so there was a lot of Irish in the family, and they lived out there for 5 years. And my eldest brother, in fact, was born out there. And so his first language was Irish. But they moved back to Kinvara then, and I grew up in Kinvara. They moved to Kinvara because my grandfather was from Kinvara, actually. So that's the connection with South Galway. So we had a lot of Irish at home. I spoke Irish to my parents. Now, I suppose as a child, there would be many occasions when they would speak Irish to us and we would reply in English, as often happens. Then I guess, yeah, Irish has a huge role in my life just now. And just to track how that has happened, I guess when I think it comes down to, first of all, I just love learning languages, actually. And in school, I would have done French and German and Irish. And so I was always interested in languages in general and was good at them. So I guess when you're good at something, you tend to like it, right? And then I wanted to get a really high level in another language. And I figured, and it was just for personal reasons. Like I said, it was kind of initially to do with this, just enjoying languages in general. And I thought, well, Irish is the obvious one. It's the one I have at the highest level already. And so I trained as a translator. And that was prompted by a couple of things as well, actually. I was working as a solicitor in Galway at the time. And in the district court in Galway, the judge, Judge Fahy at the time, she's a native Irish speaker. And when the district court would be held out in Spadle or further out west, very often there were cases to be heard in Irish. And I thought, oh my God, that would be great to be able to really work through Irish as well. So I went back and I studied and I got my qualifications as a translator. And it was for my own personal reasons, I guess. And I think, funny enough, I think a little bit like yourself, Flora, as soon as I started, other things started to happen. Other avenues opened up, and suddenly I was like, I'd spent a week down in one of the earliest kind of a course. I did a course down in Corcarina at I can't remember what exactly it was, but when I was down there, I suddenly got like out to the Blasket Islands, and then it was like reading all about Robin Flower, and then it's just like kind of following one thing after another. And then I was asked to translate some children's books into Irish. And then I actually got a call from Brussels to say, did I want to come to work in Brussels for a bit? And I did that for a few years as well. Where I'm at now is I'm back from Brussels. I live in Galway, and I'm now teaching Irish to adults. I don't know. Does that answer your question, Fleur?
Absolutely. No, I think that brings us perfectly, I think, to where we are today. And there's a couple of things I'd like to maybe go back on there and pick up on there. But before that, just so I know you do a lot of work helping other adult learners learning Irish. But what does Irish look like in your life today outside of, let's say, what you do with All About Irish? Is Irish something that features as part of your
Yeah,
life on a day-to-day
for
basis?
sure. Well, I have certain people that that Irish is our language that we speak together. So in certain social contexts, and within my family, of course, with my parents, and not with all of my siblings, interestingly enough, but with some of them. I have four siblings, so with two in particular, I'd speak quite a lot of Irish. Um, I anytime there's so many good films in Irish coming out now. Anything like that, I'll be at it. And I guess I'm in touch with learners all over the world now as well, because I teach online. So yeah,
Well, and that's interesting because I think what a lot of maybe learners, let's say outside of Ireland, I think one of the things they might find surprising or disappointing, perhaps when they come to Ireland, is the limited opportunity they have to actually use the language here because it's spoken so little. I think probably across the country, but I know you live, I think, around the city in Galway now, and just do you find yourself having an opportunity to use Irish on a regular basis in your day to day life?
within Galway City, I guess. In Galway, I think in Galway City in the last few years, you hear it a little bit more on the streets, which is really great. And actually, I live in Knocknacarra on the west side of the city, and quite a lot of people come into. There's a few big shops there. There's an Aldi and a Lidl and a Dunn's, and they come in from further out west to do their food shopping, grocery shopping. You often hear, and I'd be kind of eavesdropping when I hear Irish anywhere. I'm kind of like my ears are like instantly open and I'm listening in. So if anyone sees me coming, they'd want to watch out what they're saying. I'm I'm listening. But yeah, and then as I said, yeah, just I have certain friends and that's our language. We speak Irish together.
And so, how would you describe the role the language plays in your identity and its importance for you in your life? How does that does that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, I think because I live in Ireland, Irish is all around us everywhere. It's kind of hidden in plain sight, to use that cliche, like in all of the place names. So if even when you're wandering around the streets in Galway, the street names are in Irish and in English, um, and I guess it got me more. Funnily enough, it got me more interested in history as well. Learning Irish, I don't know exactly how that happened, but it did, and also as I said, I like languages in general. So having a very good knowledge of Irish and English, and then being able to use that to compare them to other languages and that kind of thing. And actually, just in also how other richness it's brought to my life, I guess. Because I teach online now, I'm in contact with a lot of other language teachers and some polyglots as well. And for example, I have a very good friend, and she teaches Hebrew online, and all kinds of things like. So it's brought loads of new and very interesting people into my life in different ways.
I just to maybe just make sure that I understand the chronology of it. I know you're a qualified solicitor. For some of us who are listening, maybe who are outside of Ireland, a solicitor is a particular type of lawyer here in Ireland. Did you qualify as a lawyer first, and then did the language thing kind of evolve from there, or what was the how
Yeah,
did that
I
happen?
qualified as a solicitor first, and I was working in general practice in Galway, and then it was personal interest that took me towards Irish actually, and then
Because of course, and for people outside of the legal profession and outside of Ireland in particular, may not be aware that there was a time, I'm not sure did it apply when you were qualifying as a solicitor, where you had to actually do an Irish exam before you got
Yes,
admitted
I had to do
to
that.
the
Yeah,
profession.
yeah.
Yeah, and because I'm hands up, I'm a recovering solicitor too, and I shudder to think what the what my attempt at that exam might have been back in the mid 1990s. But I mean, it's a thing that was there because there was this kind of notional thing that solicitors, all solicitors in Ireland, should be able to practice the law in Irish. But of course, I mean, the vast majority wouldn't have
Yeah, it was a
the,
ticking the
the
box exercise. I think that exam basically. Yeah, I think it's changed now the system a bit, and um, I have worked as a solicitor through Irish, and I like to do that when I get the chance.
And I suppose I just want to explore that a little bit, particularly from your personal experience, because like it is a fundamental importance. I mean, I know the language has constitutional status here, and there are lots of kind of contradictions and so on around that. But I mean, one thing I'd like to just maybe look at in particular is, I mean, when were you working in the European Commission?
I was there until 2016. So yeah, just before the Brexit vote. Actually, I was there when that happened. Yeah.
Okay, wow. Well, that must have been fascinating, and it's an interesting kind of. There's an interesting Irish community there of Irish language
Oh,
speakers in
fabulous.
Brussels, I
You know,
believe.
that
Yeah,
is so
yeah.
interesting, Fleur, and that actually would very much have coloured my view of how it could be to have a much more a society that just like doesn't view a language as a burden, but it's an extra something. It's not a burden. We can have two languages. Like in Brussels when I was there, for example. So there's quite a lot of Irish people in Brussels now because of the fact that so much of the EU documentation has to be translated into Irish. And then there are people there for other reasons as well, of course, Irish people. But there's a very good GAA club there, and because so many of us were working together as translators, obviously when we were all that was our language together. That's how we interacted with each other was through Irish. So if you went to the GAA club, we'd continue speaking Irish to each other. And then, of course, there would be people there who didn't maybe have their Irish wouldn't be quite as good or whatever. They were working in some other field in Brussels. But you never got this feeling of resentment. It was just another language. There was also some people there that were Spanish and they'd speak Spanish and that was fine. Um, whereas uh, kind of sometimes it's not that a language ever should exclude anybody, but it was just such a nice thing in Brussels that it wasn't a big deal to speak Irish. It was just like speaking another language. You weren't making a statement, you know?
Yeah, it's funny because I was speaking to somebody else who had worked in the European Commission, and they were saying to me that there was quite an enthusiasm for Irish among the Irish
Oh
community
yeah.
there because they're highly motivated translators who were obviously deeply connected with the language, but they all chose to speak to one another in Irish, and he was saying to me that actually in the other language communities from other member states, they tended to have a lingua franca of English, and they were very keen to use English because they wanted to improve their English or whatever the case would be. But the Irish were a bit weird because they would be quite insistent on speaking to one another in Irish, not even though they would have all had
Yeah,
perfect
but it
English.
makes absolute sense because it's a minority language. So when we have the opportunity to use it, I think it's important that we use it. And we were working as Irish language translators. So that should be, you know, primary then that we would obviously be speaking the language to each other as well. And I guess as well, what happens, and it happens in any situation, any work situation, or even with friends or something, there's a kind of a there's a and it's worth bearing this in mind if you meet somebody for the first time and you know they have Irish. Try to speak Irish with them from the start because once your language habit is to speak English to each other or any other language, it's kind of awkward sometimes to break that and to change that.
Isn't this one of the biggest kind of problems or challenges I think that we face as learners in terms of the Irish language is that almost always, certainly among Irish people who have come up through the Irish education system, and for many people who are learning Irish from abroad, maybe who are coming from Anglophone cultures, I mean, the one thing we know when we're together is that like we both probably have perfect English. and therefore, so we've chosen now to speak in a language maybe that's, if you like, suboptimal in terms of our ability to communicate effectively in it. And so that is a kind of an
It's a
interesting
total
challenge, isn't
catch
it?
22, isn't it? Because if you're not, if the two people are more fluent in another language, then it's easier to speak in, if the language is English, to speak in English. But obviously, then the language you're hoping to get better at doesn't get any practice. So I actually have a kind of a tip for this. I'm always trying to encourage people to speak Irish, no matter how good or bad it is. Just give it a go. But one thing I would suggest is like, supposing you were working with someone in your office floor and you knew they have a certain level of Irish, but it will be a little bit of an effort for them or for you maybe to communicate in Irish all the time. Well, how about you say to each other, listen, on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 to 12 o'clock, we're going to speak Irish to each other. And you kind of put a limit on it so that you at least do that. And then hopefully over time that might expand. But if 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 you don't do that, then this is kind of, it could feel like too much of an effort, maybe, especially if someone's Irish isn't, that fluent, because it is a bit of an extra effort, obviously.
That's a really wonderful tip, because it can feel a little bit onerous at times. And let's say if you need to do something that you just need to get sorted or get done, and maybe you don't have the vocabulary, and scheduling, blocking off a little bit of time, saying and I suppose you could start small. You could start with a
Oh,
15
totally.
minute
You
slot.
shouldn't even set an hour. It could be a 10-minute thing. Like if you want to get better at running, you don't go out and just run a marathon. You just do a little bit and try and build up a habit.
Wonderful. But can I just come back to the Brussels experience, because I'm very interested in that on a number of different levels. But particularly, I guess you finished there in 2016, around the time of that extraordinary Brexit process commenced. So I suppose at that time, Irish was not an official language of the EU, and since then, from January of this year, Irish has become a full official language of the
Yeah, it
EU.
wasn't a full official language in 2016. There was a kind of a derogation, it was called, where not everything needed to be translated. So we were translating, um, I can't remember exactly what, but certain documents, but we were not translating absolutely everything.
We're having this conversation in September 22, and the full official language status has been there now since
Everything's
January
been translated.
of this
Yeah,
year. And I was speaking to somebody recently who told me they have been working in Brussels, are working in Brussels currently, and that there were 30 people in the Irish translation section in at the beginning of the year, and there's 60 people there now, and it's completely exploding. What's your take on that? Because and what's your take? Can I put to you, let's say, what you often hear about this was, hold on, why are we spending all this money translating all of the corpus of European law and everything into this language, and maybe it's not being read. Maybe one person is reading it, or whatever the case may be. Um, what's your take on that when people say, "Look, how can that be worth it?" or how does that make any
sure.
sense?
You hear this argument so often, um, and there's a few points. There's quite a few points about it. Well, first of all, we as a state are paying into a kind of a communal budget towards translation. So why shouldn't we take advantage of that communal budget? Like, why wouldn't we, if we're paying into this, that the documents are being translated into Danish and Portuguese and so on? Why not Irish? Um, the other thing is that, well, this is one argument, is like, does anyone read the stuff in English in the first place? But I'm only joking there. That's not. But the general public really often aren't the intended audience for a lot of this legislation. It's going to be lawyers and so on. Anyways, it's not as if anybody's sitting at home reading EU legislation. So most people who throw that argument out there aren't sitting at home reading it in another language. But the other thing I'd say is the goal of the EU, and it's a very laudable objective, is to promote the cultural diversity of Europe. And one way of doing that is promoting the languages of Europe. If you take another international organization like, I think, the UN, everything is being done in, is it French and English? Completely. Why were those two languages chosen? So I think by giving status to a language, it gives it huge benefits. It provides a boost to the language. And of course, that legislation is there now in Irish if it is needed. And there have been cases brought to the brought to the EU in Irish. There have been cases through Irish. So the legislation, if it's not there, well, we certainly can't use it. But if it is there, we can.
I couldn't agree more, by the way. And I suppose I'm just putting the question there because it's one you often get, and I think it's worth addressing it. But I mean, I think it's interesting. I have heard people say that I think Irish may have been used more in the European Parliament than, say, Estonian or some of the other languages that are full day-to-day languages of some countries. And I mean, I think it's also worth remembering that it was actually the EU that pushed Irish as a full official working language. And the Irish government, if it had the choice, might have said, listen, lads, we'll just stay with the derogation for as long as we possibly can. And the other curious thing, and I'm not sure how accurate this is, but it is something I've heard, because Ireland has opted for Irish as its official language in the EU, I don't know if there's actually a member state of the EU remaining that has English as its official language. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves
Yeah,
as
I'm
time
not
goes
sure. Or
forward.
were we able to give both as our official languages? I'm not sure. Yeah, but it is true that the only, I suppose, native English speakers in the EU now really are the Irish, and I think
The
Maltese as
Maltese, of
well. Yeah.
course, yeah.
Just back to one more thing about the EU legislation or documentation, and it's not just legislation, but other things as well. I also think there is an argument, like there's so many of those Scandinavian countries at this stage. They're practically bilingual anyways. You could also say that they potentially don't need this legislation in Danish or Swedish or whatever, or the Dutch. But the like there's so many kind of hidden effects to this huge thing that has happened. First of all, so much has been done in terms of the online terminology, dictionaries. All of these things had to be updated and improved because Irish is now being used in the EU, and that goes to help everybody. That goes to help everybody who's learning Irish.
Oh, incredible. I mean, one of the things I've heard, and that I think is absolutely fascinating, is that one of the problems that the AI has had, the likes of Google Translate and so on, one of the problems that it's had in the past is it didn't have enough digital Irish, if you like, in the system to be able to learn. Whereas now, when it's all being translated and you have human translators, creating good, high quality, proper Irish translations and not just kind of English facsimiles, that this will actually help the whole system, the AI system, to learn the language properly, and that will feed into improvements in so many different technological
But
areas.
another thing is, I think that it's also given the language kind of an extra economic value. Now, I didn't kind of get back into Irish because initially I was looking at an economic benefit at all. But it's no harm that is there, because that can motivate people, and that having Irish is such a huge advantage to anybody who wants to get a job in Europe, for example, or in so many other industries in Ireland. And just in terms of getting a job in the EU institutions, I imagine that Irish is probably one of the most valuable languages to have if you want to get a job in the EU. You obviously have to have a very high standard to get a job out there. To pass all the interviews and exams and what have you. But once you pass those, the jobs are there. Once you get through the process. Whereas if you take somebody who's getting into one of these jobs using, for example, German, can you imagine the pool that you're having to compete with? It's massive, absolutely massive. So you hit this pretty high standard, and then you're on this big list.
We're in this wonderful niche that we should exploit. Yeah.
Niche is the word, yeah.
I think watch this space in relation to how Irish will evolve in the context of the EU. But you've been there, you were there before it was ever official
I
language.
think it was official, but it had this derogation.
Yeah, I mean, so that's your professional background. You're a trained lawyer, practicing lawyer, and a trained an accredited translator, and worked at a very, very high level doing that. I mean, and that's huge. I imagine time pressure and responsibility in terms of just doing those translations in real time for very important official documents. But then bring us forward to the next phase. I suppose you came back to Ireland, and then talk to us about all about Irish. Where did that come from, and how did that evolve?
Like everything else in my life, it just sort of evolves. There's no big plan. But I think, let me see, I came back from Brussels, and I was back for a while, and somebody asked me to teach an Irish class, to teach a group of adults. And they gave me the material to teach them, and I went in and did it. And I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed, and it's lovely teaching adults who are back to the language and want to learn it, and it's really enjoyable. I also started to kind of develop my own methods of teaching, so I was constantly like veering away from this content that I was supposed to be teaching. And a while after that, I guess, I had a friend who was learning Spanish, and I said, you know what's brilliant? There's this course, it's audio only. It's called Michelle Thomas Spanish. You should really do that. I highly recommend it because I had done it myself and I just thought it's brilliant. And it's a kind of a particular methodology. It's developed by this man called Michelle Thomas. He was a refugee from Poland during the Second World War, and he ended up in the States, and he taught languages and through this method. And I used it for Spanish myself and thought, God, that is amazing, right? And then I kind of suppose that got me Googling it online to say, oh, look, there it is. And suddenly I looked at the Michelle Thomas website, and there was like Chinese and Arabic and all these other languages on there. And I'm like, I'm pretty certain, he was a polyglot, but I'm pretty certain it would have been just European languages that he spoke. Why is there a Michelle Thomas Chinese course? And I got in touch with the publishers. I think I got in touch with, I saw Hindu, and I managed to find the Hindu author on Facebook. So I got in touch with him, and I said, how did you make the Michelle Thomas? How did all that come about? He said, oh, contact the publishers. And I got in touch with the publishers, and of course, the usual story. They ignored me the first time, and then eventually I got through to them. And in the meantime, I was also talking with a great friend of mine. She was working in NUIG at the time, Dr. Eilish Niyul, and she would also have taught Irish to adults down the years, and she was really interested in it as well. So we made a joint proposal, the two of us, to the Michelle Thomas publishers in London. And then we set up a pilot program in Galway so that we could kind of put the material together for the Irish course and try it out. And that was interesting because the Michelle Thomas starts with the person who has absolutely no knowledge of the language. So we had to we found some foreign students in Galway. There was Italians and Spaniards and so on, and they all came in and did a little bit of Irish with us, and we tried it out. And then when we were happy with the material, we went over to London, and it's recorded in a studio over there with two students, and they had no Irish at all. And it then we recorded over the course of 4 days, and then it's kind of edited down to an 8-hour course. And we had great fun doing that as well. So that was the Michelle Thomas course. And that's available through the Michelle Thomas website. Then I guess I started more and more to develop my own materials after that. And I really like the Michelle Thomas approach. So my own approach is also very much built on that as well.
And what we will do is we'll make these links available in the show notes for anybody who is interested. But that was pioneering work in terms of bringing the Irish language to the Michelle Thomas system. But you went a step further then, and then you developed your own teaching platform for the language. Tell me more about that.
So I started to develop my own methods, and my focus when I teach adults is I want people to understand the structure of the language, to start to see the patterns in the language. And I want to explain things because especially with Irish, there's this thing where the initial mutations, for example, the sound of the start of a word changes. So you take a simple word like boat, which is bod, and that suddenly could become maud, right? I'm in the boat, Thoma e maud. So we've bod, maud, and we might talk about sailing the boat, Exola and wad. Now we bod, maud, and wad. 3 words, they sound completely different for the same thing. So I like to teach people what's happening and what's this all about, and to use our knowledge maybe of other languages that we might know, English, and then to use that to help us learn this new language. Because I think in Ireland sometimes people say I'm no good at Irish. I did it for 14 years, but I just feel that sometimes things were not explained very much, and if something isn't explained and you don't understand it, well, you'd have to get an awful lot of immersion then to get it on your ear, a huge amount, which isn't going to happen in the school environment.
That's something that I want to come back to the structure piece. I think this is fundamental, and it's I guess I kind of learned that the hard way, kicking and screaming the wrong way around. and I want to come back to that. But just for a second, because you mentioned there something that I know you've spoken about this before, is this thing that comes out all the time in relation to Irish people who've gone through the Irish education system is, oh, I've done 14 years of Irish and I can't speak a word of it. The education system must be complete rubbish, or the language must be impossible to learn, or whatever the case may be. Can we just unpack that, as they say, a little bit? I mean, it's not as it's not as obvious or intuitive as it might seem in terms of there's 14 years, but it's not
It's not
really
really
that we don't
14
really
years.
spend
Yeah,
that much
it's
time
not like
learning.
someone's solidly learning something for 14 years. And um, I think people need to cut themselves a bit of slack as well, you know? Like, it takes quite a bit of time and commitment to really learn a language to a high level. And often Irish people know a lot more than they think, right? There can be quite good passive understanding, which is actually huge, where you could say to somebody, tour them a banya, no, whatever, give me this or give me that, or look at your man over there. I might speak in Irish to friends who would say they don't have much Irish. But I know if I say that in a certain way and kind of slowly and break up the words so they can hear them, they'll know what I'm saying. That's actually a really good, that's pretty good, you know? And I guess I'm more aware of that now since I started teaching people all over the world. So when you start teaching somebody who really has no Irish, maybe who grew up in the States or the UK or whatever, and you're having to explain so many things, like talk them, okay, put the verb first. Then and you explain so many things, or even the way because people living in Irish are used to seeing words in Irish, and so seeing text in Irish doesn't sort of shock us as much as it might otherwise. So we can see the name Siobhan and know and Neve and know that MH is like a V sound. It's not an outrageous thing to us to see NIMH, even if we have poor Irish. That's actually a good head start, you know. So I think having done it in school is anyone who's done it in school and feels they should have learned more. Look, just get over that. Forget it. Sometimes maybe
I completely agree with you in terms of that. That's something we just need to cut ourselves
slack. Yeah.
slack and allow ourselves to be well, in my case, to be rubbish at it, because I think you've got to just make the mistakes, and it's by making the mistakes that you learn and allow yourself not. And this is another thing I feel, because we are kind of, I feel like, conditioned to be so correct. We're always, if we're speaking in English, as we're growing up as kids, our grammar is corrected. If we say, I ain't, or if we say, imperfect grammar, we're kind of, if you like, corrected, and that's a little bit embarrassing. So I think then, as adult learners trying to speak and give it a lash, and knowing that you're going to be coming out with stuff that is grammatically incorrect, can
We
be
can
a
be
little bit
self-conscious
intimidating for
about
people.
making mistakes. Yeah.
Sure, but Patricia, this is kind of one of the problems I think we have with it, as people who've come to, let's say, if we're people who've come to the Irish education system. There was this kind of assumption, I think, in terms of teaching the language, that, oh, well, you've been doing it for 14 years via primary school and secondary school, you kind of pick it up, and we don't really need to go deep into the structure of the language, because you've been doing it for so long. All that's a given, but we don't pick it up. And this is the problem, I think. And we come out. I mean, I certainly came out at the end of education. I was not a good example, but certainly when I went back to learn Irish as an adult learner, I mean, things like, for instance, the fact that we had, masculine and feminine nouns in Irish. That was I never knew that. After I finished secondary
I
school,
thought it would be uncommon. I think that would be most people. Yeah.
how, how we pronounce the sounds of certain word combinations in Irish. You mentioned some of them there in terms of names that we are familiar with, but in terms of words in particular, because we're so used to pronouncing things using English language word and spelling structure, and then we come across to the Irish language pronunciation, and nobody ever sat us down and said, by the way, this is what happens when you have you know a slender consonant, or so on. So I mean, but you, I think, have come to this. You come to this with structure as the first thing that you do.
Yeah, I do. I actually do. Yeah, I kind of try to teach structure because I want people to understand what's going on. And then once you understand it, it means that if you're reading something or if you hear it, you start to notice it. You don't have to get it right every time you use it. Like, absolutely not. That's not the goal. But at least if you understand it in the first place, then you can start to spot it's just spotting patterns. And once you spot patterns, then yeah, you're away, I think. But you're talking about pronunciation there as well. And another thing I think we need to be aware of course, and I guess there can be this misconception that because we're living in Ireland and we might speak Irish, that we can use the sounds of English, that they're not, that they have the same sound system, but which they don't. Like, the sounds of French are not the same as the sounds of English. There's different sounds in French, and certain sounds in French that don't exist in English, and there's certain sounds in Irish that don't exist in English. And it's kind of good to be aware of them, and then to be kind of listening out for them, and then we might have to get a bit of muscle memory going by practicing them. Like an obvious example of that now, Fleur, would be a word with like CH in it. You know this, like if I say but in Irish, ACH, ah, and it's this CH kind of at the back of your throat. That's actually a sound we don't have in English. It's like the sound.
If you look at church in English, so if we look at ch, we can see it written as church, or we see shay in French. We have a ch that is a totally different sound, and then we have ach, which is a totally different sound, and we say, well, that's not how ch should sound, because that's
What
what we're
happens, Fleur,
used
is
to.
we go to the nearest sound to that in our own in the other language that we have, the other language that we speak,
Mm,
and the nearest sound to this h is the k sound, the k in English, so that you might
mhm,
hear somebody saying ack, ach, as
mm,
opposed to ach.
mm,
There's a bit of a difference,
mm,
but
mm,
I like to
mm,
teach these things as they're. This is the beauty of the language. It's to start listening for the sounds. It's
mm,
not to get them right all the
mm,
time, or it's just to
mm.
listen and notice them.
Or for instance, there is a difference between queer and where.
Yeah, yeah,
Do you know what I mean? That this and this is you talk about the initial mutation, that H there at the beginning, and the difference that makes of the sound has a completely fundamental difference in terms of the meaning of the word that you're using, whether it's in
past
the
tense or
present tense or the
yeah,
past tense, or whatever the case may
yeah,
be. And so I suppose what you're saying is, rather than just kind of hope that people are going to absorb this
yeah.
by osmosis, and it didn't
No,
work for 14 years in my experience. So it's something that we need to
yeah,
tackle at the
yeah,
beginning and get right into that. So that's the approach that you take with the
yeah.
structural Irish.
I like to take the view that we're all no. What is that? Uh, Anything could be taught.
Mm-hmm.
And actually this is very much the Michelle Thomas approach. It's that, like, it's the teacher should know what to teach and when to teach it, and in some ways it's the responsibility of the teacher to get that across in a way that the learner can understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And not expect the learner to kind of pick this up
Muddle their way
intuitively,
through it. Yeah,
or some muddle their way
yeah,
through it. Yeah. So can we just talk then, I guess, in terms of from your experience now, where are the people that come to you? Where are they coming from? Are they because I'd love to get a feel for what level of interaction with the language you're seeing, and what your kind of students
yeah.
look like
Yeah,
in terms of their
I'm
profile.
smiling here, Fleur, because I have I have fabulous students. Because when people come back to learn Irish, they're usually very motivated, and
Mm-hmm.
I think they start to, once you start, no more than yourself, and other things open up. This kind of richness opens up, and but where are they from? So in my beginner courses, they would be might even be half people living in Ireland and half the States, the UK, the odd other country. Australia. I have some people in Australia who get up at 5 a.m., which is a fair play to them. And the people in America obviously often have Irish heritage, but not always. I've had some people coming as well because they're very interested in languages in general. And, Irish being a Celtic language, that's unusual. It's interesting. It's an interesting language to learn. And then the Irish people who would come back to beginner Irish, because this is a course that takes people right from the start. It assumes no knowledge, no prior knowledge. And I do have people who have gone and done Irish in school, but came out the end of it just totally demoralized and feeling like, which is really awful. Why should somebody feel shame? But, feeling bad because they didn't, they feel they should be better. And sometimes they start right at the start with beginner Irish to really get the basics right and then go on from there. So then after that, there's kind of higher level courses. I've a course called Beyond Beginner, which is based around conversations, and um, I have a couple self-study courses there as well now and things like that. So yeah, I'm kind of developing them all the time. Yeah.
Okay, so we have one category which is Irish people who were educated or grew up in Ireland and went through the Irish education system and are going back to learn the language again. And again, roughly, would you say is that a significant minority, a majority? Would you have any sense of the kind of
Yeah.
level?
So the intermediate classes will be more Irish people,
Okay, who are
because
coming back to the
the
language
beginner,
from the education
yeah.
system. And then when we look at people, when we look at abroad, I mean, is it? Would you say would a significant number of people abroad, are they coming from, let's say, Irish
Yes, Irish
heritage?
heritage. And very often I think there's some connection to the ancestry, or even somebody in the family that spoke Irish way back, and there's a feeling that the language was lost and kind of reclaiming it. And with Irish people, then I think there's a feeling of sometimes it's a challenge, and I want to get there. I want to. Why shouldn't I be able to do this? And anybody can. And then there's so much more positivity around the language anyways, with all these, there's some great films and TV programs, and it's more visible maybe than it was. The other beauty of learning a language, it could be any language, and I've discovered this myself through the last number of years, is like, and especially with Irish, actually, there's this extra thing with Irish. It's a real connection with somebody. It's almost like I'm going to say a secret society or something, but it's a really common interest. And when you speak to somebody in that language, in Irish, there's an extra connection, I feel. Yeah. And also it's people of all ages and all backgrounds. And
But just tell me, why do you find people coming back to the language? What do you find is the reasons they give you for coming back to you to learn again?
I guess it's almost this intangible thing of a sense of identity,
Mm-hmm.
um, that sense of place, maybe. It's what makes
Mm-hmm.
us
Mm-hmm.
different, is this we like to have our own sense of identity. It's a very strong sense of identity in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is quite sad when you think about it, that once upon a time, it was spoken all over the country, um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of just retreated so much. Um,
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the greatest tragedies that I find about it is that so much of our culture that has kind of come down to us via poetry and song and a lot of well, and then we have this very extraordinary rich manuscript tradition, which is completely inaccessible to us as non-Irish. If we can't speak Irish, the only way we can experience our own culture as Irish people is via translations into English often, and I think that's a great pity, which learning the language gives us some additional access into that.
oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. When you think of it, that it was one of the great languages of Europe, at the time of the monks and those great manuscripts and
Mm,
all of that. You were
mm,
doing some studies in
mm,
that area
mm.
yourself, or weren't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, no, and it's just, I know you've shared, some poems and songs that you use as part of your learning, but I think that whole being able to connect into that tradition directly and understand it, directly in the primary language in which that art was created, I think is a huge thing in terms of our access to culture. But you say that you find a lot of the people coming to the language as adult learners are more highly motivated, and you find that what motivates people? Do you have a sense of that?
I think, when they come back and they start to, and what I love teaching Irish people who didn't kind of do too well in school, or maybe did okay in school, is when they kind of go, oh, that makes sense. And just a feeling of like, oh, okay, this isn't just this random thing where people, there was H's being flung in and thrown out, and red lines put through things, and that there actually is a, you know, structure to the language, and it can be learned.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. And I mean, I suppose but just by going back to some fundamentals, we can actually make sense of things that we
Yeah.
found incomprehensible when we were trying to learn it.
To get a sense of achievement from something is always positive. Um, for some people, it's a sociable thing. You can often then join a local Circle Cora, or maybe join a book club in Irish. There's other outlets. You meet other people it's an extra outlet for someone, you know?
The pop-up Gaeltachtaí have been a phenomenon
Yeah,
here
at
as well,
every
yeah, and
age,
internationally
and
as
of
well,
course,
I
you
think.
know, and I have quite a few retired people who come back and learn Irish, and they have a bit more time and can really enjoy it then. But of course, learning a language and at any age is such a good thing for the brain, anyways. You know, for staving off all kinds of illnesses and stuff.
How far do you see people take it, Patricia? Where do people go
Yeah,
with it?
my take on learning a language is like it's good to get some instruction at the start to kind of get you moving, and then I love when people can get to the point where they're independent learners. So now starting to read initially, I won't say exactly for pleasure because it is a little bit of work at the start, but to get to the point where you know a person can sit down and read something in Irish, a little novel or a children's novel or something, and then starting to listen a little bit more and more to Irish radio or to podcasts in Irish or whatever, and to starting to watch. So starting to learn passively at that stage, to get to that level where you know you're learning just because you're listening to it and reading it and hopefully speaking it maybe with.
And what do you think then? Because you mentioned passive there. I'm not sure if this is the correct way to describe it, but what's your take then on things like? I mean, one of the things that a lot of people who, whenever I talk about Irish, they say, "Oh yeah, I understand." That Duolingo is where they always go to start. What do you make of Duolingo and apps like that? And
Well, I haven't really, you know, and I should go in and try the Irish one sometimes, and it certainly gets some plenty of people seem to like it, and I'm sure it's good for learning vocabulary and for doing a little bit. At the same time, I do come across people who come and they say I've been doing Duolingo for like a year or 2 years, and I really still can't speak or whatever. But you know, I'm sure it's helpful. But it won't be enough on its own. It certainly won't be enough on its own. Yeah.
sure. I mean, I started using Duolingo, and I found it. I mean, I found it very good in terms of like that now for just raising awareness on vocabulary. But there was a certain element where you could kind of game the system a little bit, and you could kind of, they would give you a sentence that you had to translate, but there were only a certain number of available words to use to select for the translation. So you could make an educated guess on which would go where, and I found, and also the owl became extremely passive aggressive as I went along. If I didn't show up, the owl would kind of say, "You haven't done your practice today," and eventually I just decided to sack the owl.
I
So.
don't like it myself. This is a personal thing because, like, I just like getting off screens. I'm on screens a lot. I'm on the phone, I'm on the laptop, so I just love getting off the screen. So, which is why I think audio is a nice way to learn. Actually, you know, just listening, because you can be walking, you can be doing whatever.
But tell us now. We're here now. We've spoken a lot about. I mean, your background and your philosophy in terms of teaching and the system that you have developed around that. I wonder if you're somebody who's listening to this now and who is obviously interested in the language because they're here, perhaps, and but is wondering what could they do? How do they get moving? What tips would you have for somebody who wants to just start learning Irish? I mean, are there any things you'd like to share with them?
It's kind of difficult, Fleur, because you know everybody's so different, and I could say, you know, Duolingo might be just the right thing for somebody to get them started and moving, and could be just put someone else off completely. Um, Obviously, I teach I teach classes, so I think a class is can be good because at least it commits you to a certain time every week. You'll be interacting with other people, um, and then if somebody is of a more intermediate level, then um, to start watching, pick a program on TV maybe that you like, and start watching that regularly. So for example, and I did this when I was in Brussels, and I was, you know, living in Brussels. Obviously, there's a lot of French spoken there, and I was trying to improve my French. But of course, it got put on the long finger. It was I'm going to get round to that. And then eventually I said, no, I have to start doing something here. And I said, right, I'll watch the news in French every day for a month. So I put an end limit on it. It wasn't like I'll watch TV in French, which is just so general. Was kind of this vague goal that was supposed to happen but never happened. Then I said I'll watch the news in French every day for a month, and I did it because you can do anything for a month. And by the end of the month, then I was, you know, happy out watching the news in French, and I would do it willingly then after that. But I had to put in that kind of initial set a goal, set a target. Like learning a language takes a bit of effort, you know. It takes a little bit of planning, and you know people are busy as well, so you know depends what somebody's doing. And
you've got to put in the effort, get the kind of critical mass, so that
Yeah.
you can then can build
You
momentum
have to
from
get
there.
to a
But
certain level so that you can be at the level where now, you can start to learn passively, I think. Yeah. But
mm, mm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, because TG Cahar, I think, has some wonderful programs and a lot of. I mean, they provide subtitles on practically everything. I was just recently watching a Theo Dorgan film on the on Buchel Goel Gorach. It's a movie about a Brennan Beam song that that was picked up and translated into Greek and became a huge iconic song in Greece, and fascinating actually around the history of Greece. But it's all there and it's the film is, I highly recommend to watch it. It's on the TG Car Player, but it is in English, Greek, and Irish throughout the film, and all of it is subtitled to us. So I mean, you can, and again, and I know they have an awful lot of programs like that where you can actually listen to the Irish, have subtitles, and maybe I've heard some people actually spent summers watching cartoons, kids programming in Irish, and learning via the subtitles.
oh
So
yeah, kids programs
so
are
so
great, like, it's definitely. And actually, just funny, if anybody has small kids out there, my sister, my nieces, and they'd be watching TV, and I would be just saying, put that on in TG Car, and so it should be the default almost. If every child in Ireland was watching their cartoons in Irish on TG Car, um, that would be amazing. Like, and the kid doesn't know the difference, you know.
we talk about having spent 14 years in school, but of course of those 14 years, well, first of all, half the year we're not in
Yeah.
school, and then of the half of the time we are there, we're probably only doing Irish maybe a couple of hours a week. But the immersion at that younger age can have an extraordinarily big impact for young kids up. So that is a great tip for somebody who's looking to introduce Irish across the household a little bit more. Patricia, I'd like to, I suppose, just to kind of maybe wrap up at this stage, one of the questions that final questions I'd like to put to you, and your thoughts on this is it worth it? I mean, you mentioned that it's effort, and that there is, there's work that has to be put in, and sometimes we have to go back to the fundamentals, learn the structure. Some of that may be a little bit, well, it's simply work. Is it worth it, all of
Hmm.
that effort?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, 100%. I mean, anything is worth learning, I think, you know? And the language adds, honestly, so much because it comes into every facet of life in Ireland, you know? Place names, the way we speak English in Ireland is influenced by the Irish language. Uh, I just, I don't know. Once you start, it's nearly hard to stop. Yeah.
Well, because as you go through each stage of your kind of learning journey, you're uncovering a new
Yeah.
layer that gives you a deeper sense of satisfaction.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Patricia Achara, gur míle maithagad bhain me ansop as an scéal a Ryan Tooling, berbua agus
Gur
banach
míle
lecar.
maith agat, Fleur. Slán.
Thanks for listening. Gur míle maithagad as a bheith éisteacht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate, and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamil.